And if you want to get into this bagger world that's popular right now, ride with the saddlebags with the Batwing fairing. Here, the famous Batwing fairing with the frame-mounted ignition, which is more old school. Well, the icon of this segment, Harley Davidson, right? You're talking about 150,000 raised for a Fat Bob lowrider if you go into the glide line, right? Road glide, street glide, which are the bikes used as the base in the Bagger World Cup. You're talking about 150, 180, 190, 200,000 reas. And besides spending a fortune, you won't be able to ride them in the city because they're too big and heavy. But for getting out on the road, it's a beautiful machine. Your problems are over with the Moto Morini Calibro bagger. This is the custom line from the Italian brand, still not very well known in Brazil, but it's a brand with a lot of tradition. A brand from 1937, almost 90 years of history, whose slogan is Heredità e Passione, heritage and passion. It's arriving in Brazil with a complete line focused on medium and high displacement motorcycles, all coming from the factory with Moto engine oil, coolant and brake fluid. In other words, a guarantee of quality and performance, this Calibro bagger. Here it has a parallel twin-cylinder engine, 700 cubic centimeters, 68 horsepower, 7 kilogram meters of torque, and I'll show you here. Look. If you want to know the main information about this bike's performance, it's right here on the tachometer. It's a high-revving bike, red line of 10,000 RPM, so its behavior is more Italian than Harley-like. It's not the behavior of a classic cruiser. When we accelerate, of course, the bike's geometry and weight distribution, even though it's a smaller and lighter bike, right? Although it's not that light, it's a 200 kilo bike. Of course, it's more agile than a Harley Rallizona, but it still has the classic custom dynamics. Let's be honest, it doesn't handle medium and low speed corners well, right? Because it's just a bit lacking in the front end, that's it. But it seems to me like a very good formula to really connect with a segment that hasn't been reached yet. For the Brazilian audience, right, if you wanted a big cruiser, wanted this Harley-like look, at a price way below 100,000 raised, right, 57,000, the exclusive color of this bagger is this one, quartz black. It's a very well finished bike, right? You can see here, it has a metal gas cap, the finish on the saddlebags here, there's leather inside, it's really well done. And Moto Morini has a very interesting story on its own, right? Actually, Italian motorcycle brands usually are, right? They usually have a family tree that's more complicated than Neymar's, right? Moto Morini, as I said, was founded in 1937, became known in Italy for street-style bikes, also custom bikes back in the 70s and 80s, changed owners several times, right? Just like Ducati, just like Cagiva. Cagiva itself once owned Moto Morini, and the brand was kind of dormant, struggling along until it was bought in 2018. Baijiang Feng, it's a Chinese group, Zian, also known and notable for making mopeds, scooters, low displacement motorcycles, and they invested money into Moto Morini. And they're bringing the brand back to life around the world and also in Brazil, right? It's kind of similar to what happened with Royal Enfield, right? Which was saved by Indian investors back at the end of the decade, or rather in the 2010s. Moto Morini, however, unlike Royal Enfield, has a broader approach, right? A lineup that includes naked bikes, the 600 Setsumetsu, right? With a 650 engine, so there are naked bikes. There's also a scrambler derived from the 600 Sekimetsu, which is obviously a 650, as the name suggests. There are trail bikes, right? There's a line of trails around the 400cc range. There's the X-Cape, which is the flagship of the big trails. Even reaching 1,200cc, this bike is coming, the X-Cape 1,200. It looks like a Cagiva elephant, right? The fact that Cagiva used to own Moto Morini is interesting, right? If you look at this Morini X-Cape 1,200, it looks a lot like the Ducati Desert X, because both are inspired by the look of the Cagiva elephant, right? Both have the same DNA roots, so to speak. Anyway, it's a very complete lineup of bikes that started here in Brazil with a dealership in Santo André. It seemed like a rather unusual choice, right, for a brand with a more premium positioning. Nothing against Santo André, but if you want to build a new brand in Brazil, you don't start with Santo André, you start with São Paulo, preferably Avenida Europa and the surrounding area. But they've already expanded, if I'm not mistaken. There are 7 dealerships now. There's Goiânia, Curitiba. They're moving into the main capitals. And I'll tell you guys, I've really pushed the bike already. And it surprised me exactly because it has that engine temperament that's much more Kawasaki, you know, a Kawasaki Italian, let's say, a revving engine rather than Harley, even more than Royal Enfield, than the classic behavior of classic bikes. And within this concept, with more passion, more sportiness, more speed, I love this scene with my name, right, Johnny? Yeah, you can see here, right, we have a large front brake disc. The suspension travel also surprised me. It's a suspension that on this type of heavy bike, especially the rear, the weight distribution, we usually get harsh hits on the rear suspension, but it handles it well. And you can also see here, look, the little sticker, Manaus Free Trade Zone. The bike is being assembled here in Brazil, right? Even though it's manufactured in China, right? The story, the DNA. And just like Royal Enfield, right? Which has the research and development center, right? Where the bikes are designed. And most of the engineering is done in England, but the assembly is done in India, which is cheaper. And that's where the parent company is. Let's put it that way. In the case of Morini, it's the same thing, the research and development center. It's still in Italy, but the manufacturing is done in China. That's why it comes at relatively competitive prices here, but it's assembled in the Manaus Free Trade Zone. It has passion, but it also has that real custom personality. You know, look at how the foot peg is pushed forward, right? Kind of a fat bob position. And the handlebar is also relatively wide, so you can be in that more relaxed cruiser position. But what I liked most was its versatility. The fact that it can handle itself well in the chaos of São Paulo traffic. So let's do this. Hop on the chin bar and let's listen here while moving to the roar of the twin cylinder. Be honest, you were startled, right? That wasn't the sound you expected from a custom bagger. Let's go. But after all, how does it ride, Deputy, huh? The suspension travel is actually pretty decent, right? For this type of bike, you know, usually. Yes, I'm talking about you, Harley 883, which was my first bike here in São Paulo. The shotgun from Royal itself, you know, they have a shorter suspension travel like that. Yeah, right away you can see that the Calibro bagger it's a custom bagger, but it's also an Italian bike. You know, it has a sportier feel within this segment, of course. Don't forget that when we're talking about this type of custom bike, a big custom like this, we're talking about bikes that have a weight distribution that's very much to the back. You know, with your feet stretched out way up front and the seat, your glorious butt way back there. It's the whole caster thing, right? The setup of this type of bike is such that they really don't want to take tight turns, you know, like making a U-turn here. It's almost like a mountain bike. Look, you have to throw your body way forward to bring the front of the bike along with you, like right here, see? Otherwise, you'll end up in the other lane. It has that sporty little growl, you know, man. The turn signals here are also in that Harley custom style, right? With a switch on each side, left turn signal, right turn signal. But on my beloved XR 1200, another Harley I had in my collection, man, they had self-canceling turn signals. Here, look, I leaned a lot to the right, put the bike upright again, and wow, the turn signal is still on. You have to remember to activate, or rather to deactivate the turn signal always manually. And here, parallel twin cylinder, look, it's really torquey, right? And it revs up, there's a red line up there at 10 grand. It revs up more eagerly than a Royal 650, for example. This engine has its origins in the Kawasaki R6 engine, right? So, it's a Japanese origin engine, even though it's made by Morini nowadays. It's a higher revving engine, right, in this twin cylinder category. And it doesn't have that typical twin rumble, right, but it does have a rough growl that I admit I like it. It really appeals to me. And then also another situation, right, where you benefit. You benefit by not buying a Harley Dynaglide or something like that. It's the size, right? It's a bike that's compact enough for you to handle this crazy traffic here in São Paulo, man, which is getting worse and worse, right? It's 7 in the morning. Where are all these people going? I thought everyone worked remotely during the pandemic. This batwing fairing here is pretty cool too. It protects well from the wind. There must even be some lush audio quality going on there. With the batwing fairing blocking the wind from hitting my face here, I'm gonna head into the gap between lanes here, man. Power, that's really important too. It's kind of being blocked by the guy in front. But look, in Sao Paulo, right, this instant torque is no exaggeration. But this engine is very flexible. You know, it makes your life a lot easier. There are 6 gears. Notice here we have the gear selector showing everything. The dashboard has a bit of a retro vibe, you know, with the tachometer well lit. I like the fact that the numbers are illuminated, not just the backdrop. Look, there's an ambulance up ahead. Yeah. But it also has a touch of modernity with the gear selector and the digital speedometer. The digital speedometer is another thing that, in reality, for driving in Sao Paulo, where there are speed cameras everywhere, is also always very welcome. And here, right, I don't know if we can, after we leave here, if you're from Sao Paulo, you already know, but if you're not, this is the biggest hassle here on the marginal, which now, in the case of motorcycles, is made worse by the ambulance, but it gets much worse here on the ride, all the way to Avenida dos Bandeirantes. Look, power, you position yourself better, you can come and get the pole position in the lane. What do we have up ahead? A 350 right from Royal. It's not exactly a direct competitor. But the entrance here is the entrance to Nova Berrin at the Morumbi Bridge, right? See, browse hardworking people heading to Bandeirantes, for example. So after getting through these 2 bottlenecks here, we have the first one. Things open up a bit and we can speed up a little. Look, real world test, man, how does it do in a tight box? Look, its caster is actually pretty. It's less aggressive, right, than on more custom bikes where you struggle to maneuver here, right? I was going to say stop and go in Sao Paulo traffic, but many times in that situation, you're just stopped and stopped. Look, it's narrow enough for you to find your way to the exclusive motorcycle stopping lane here. Taking off in 2nd gear, right? Nice and easy. 70 horsepower and almost actually more than 7 kg of torque. Why even bother with the roundabout, right, bro? This kind of turn 2 is not really what this type of bike likes. That's more than enough for the bike's 200 kg dry weight, right? Yeah, I keep mentioning Royal, right? Not just because giving you a little behind the scenes info. Yesterday I was filming Barra, but if you look at the spec sheet, it's pretty similar, right? Yeah, Morini in this custom line here, right? Both the bagger and the non-bagger version, it has the Siameso, right? And the 652, which is another classic engine size from Royal. But the Siameso here in Brazil, we have the versions, right? Naked and scrambler models. But it seems to me, in terms of performance, technical specs, price, it's a little step above, right? A step forward, of course, for the guy who would like, for example, to move on from the world of Royals, right? Which are, they're really cool bikes, but when it comes to offering that little extra performance, especially on the highway, right? They're just a bit lacking. And then here, looking at this whole line of Royals custom bikes, right? Shotgun is the Interceptor itself, right? It's not a custom, but it's a more relaxed bike to ride. I'm forgetting the name. There's the Custom 650, right? Or what's the other custom? It's called the Horace Custom. So here you have 70 horsepower, right? That's a 20 horsepower difference. The Royals have 47 on the 650, right? That's a 23 horsepower difference. It's not a negligible difference, not. And then you have, especially for those who ride with a passenger, right? You get a performance boost. It's a pretty interesting jump in performance. It's a jump that's also accompanied by a pretty significant price increase, right? 57,000 Rs for this bagger. 51,000 Rs for the custom without the bags, right? Oh, hey, but it rides better than a Royal, right? Yeah. So I would say it is. No Royal costs more than 40,000, right? Unless I'm mistaken here, I don't think so. You're getting into, in the case of the Morinis, even Triumph territory, right? In that range of 50, 60,000, that's what's selling in the premium market, according to our friends in the industry that we interact with. On the big highway, right? On the long curve, that's where the Morini shines and I mess up, right, my brother? I'm going to be amazed here by the view of the bridge. and end up on the express lane of the marginal where motorcycles aren't allowed, man. At least there's an exit just ahead here. This is something only someone who's lived in Sao Paulo for a long time would know, right? I've been here for 20 years in Sao Paulo. In a year and a half, Sao Paulo will surpass Porto Alegre as the city where I've lived the longest in my life, right? I left Porto Alegre when I was 22. That's crazy, Rogerinho. Yeah, I don't know if that's something to be proud of or something to be depressed about. See the LED blinker? It's working. Yeah, so it seems like a good value to me, right? It's an entry-level price that isn't too intimidating for a brand that, although it has a lot of history in Italy, doesn't have much tradition in Brazil. There's a matter of brand building here, right? Morini, for example, the first dealership in São Paulo in Santo André, right? If you have this more premium positioning, good products, right? Products that deliver on that premium proposition. Yeah, and prices too, high starting prices. I don't know if Santo André is the ideal choice for Morini's first dealership. So that's the thing. They'll have to build the brand to be able to... Look at BYD here. It's a great example. BYD, right? A car brand that 5 years ago nobody knew in Brazil. And they did a good job building the brand. And today, Brazilians who have money, you know, they don't feel embarrassed, let's say, to pay 300 grand for a BYD. Allowing for the obvious differences, that's kind of the challenge for Morini, right? Building that brand for your product, which isn't exactly cheap, but it's good to find acceptance in our market. Do you agree, disagree? Tell us, what do you think about Morini's place in the market? I confess that we tested it outside its natural habitat, right? The natural habitat of this bike is the open road. A steady 120, 130 kilometers an hour. It does really well with this 6-speed gearbox. And this engine likes to rev up to 10,000, right? For a custom twin cylinder. It's really an unusual number. Let's put it that way. Leave a like on this video. Subscribe to the channel. Thank you as always. Take care, big hug and power. Look, look, look. What a nice little bike. It's a little bike, guys. It's a motorcycle with an A at the end. Little bike. Sometimes it's so hard for us on the internet. Brazilian automotive or motorcycle industry. Time extended. Look at this. Have you seen it? A custom revving like that. At 10 grand on a hard launch, right? We're used to this kind of bike. When the revs start to climb, the engine starts to shake and kind of nudge you like, hey, are you crazy? That's not what I'm made for. The Moto Morini, like I said, is a custom bike with Italian passion. Now we're talking. Thanks a lot. Take care of yourselves. And a big hug.